We live in a world our ancestors would barely recognize. Around the globe, the impact of human ingenuity is now everywhere. We've pushed back the limits of our planet at speeds, depths, and heights that would have left our forebears breathless. Driving all these achievements is humankind's extraordinary gift for invention. Through genius and inspiration, we've created exceptional solutions to complex problems. From the everyday to the spectacular, some good and some not so good. This series celebrates the million ways our great inventions have transformed our world.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
What made our rise from nomads to great civilization possible? What challenged the human pioneering spirit time and again? Past advanced civilizations bequeathed it to us, and over millennia, it evolved into the tremendous diversity we see today. It has become such an integral part of global cultures and religions that little else compares to it. We taxed our ingenuity to perfect it over and over. A mainstay of our nourishment, it led to new innovations that allowed us to produce enough for everyone. And now, climate change is presenting agriculture, breeders and scientists with the challenge of securing this #1 staple for the future.
So although it's commonplace and it's everyday, it's also quite extraordinary.
It is known and shared with one another by the most diverse of cultures. Across the globe, it is enjoyed in thousands of variations on a daily basis.
All the energy has gone into it and released all these nutrients that I can just digest without having to do any real work. It's great.
Families share it with one another. It's part of every meal.
So if I close my eyes, I suppose what comes to mind immediately is it's the best thing to wake up to in the morning.
The significance of this comestible goes way beyond its value as nourishment. It forms the basis of the human diet. Bread.
Breads and cereals can be found in food from all over the world, like tortillas from Mexico, pumpernickel from Scandinavia,
rice cakes from China, hush puppy from the deep south.
The concept of bread is global. France has baguette, Italy has ciabatta, and naan is ubiquitous in India. Every day in Mexico, tortillas are eaten, and in Turkey, locals have been baking flat bread since time immemorial. In Scandinavia, it's crisp bread, and Britons, too, have unique versions.
You've got your classic white loaf, you've got your English muffins, you've got your Scottish scones, you've got your Welsh bara brith, and you've got your Irish soda farls. We do bread of every type, and it's all fantastic.
Amazing variety evolved over the centuries. Different countries, different types of bread.
I think what is interesting is that, even within one continent like Europe, you can go from one country to another country and the bread types change dramatically. And even within those countries, there are lots of different bread types.
Bread is on a never-ending triumphant march.
In Korea too, less rice is being eaten in favor of more bread. It's more flexible and there are more variations. It's a trend that will be replicated across other continents. Even in Africa, more bread than maize porridge will be eaten.
It is Germany that offers the greatest and most unique diversity when it comes to bread. In fact, since 2014, Germany's bread and bread culture has UNESCO cultural heritage status. Not only does it enjoy worldwide popularity, it is also uniquely diverse. Apart from pumpernickel and whole grain, there is also white bread. Germany has 3,200 types of bread. That's more than any other country. Over the course of time, bread has engendered numerous professions. Modern-day industrial bakers, millers, bread cognoscenti, and traditional craft bakers. What they all have in common is their love of bread. But it was a long journey.
The amazing thing about bread is it tells the story of our civilization's movement from ancient times into modern society today. Around 10,000 years ago, bread was a kind of mushy cereal porridge. This cereal porridge was flawed. It ground your teeth down, it didn't taste great, and it didn't combine well with other foods. It was only when they discovered the solid loaf of bread that they realised that bread is the ultimate food.
First, we had to make an easily digestible bread from this cereal porridge, which hardens so quickly.
So if we think about innovation, what comes to mind is the wheel, which changed the course of history. But bread was invented several millennia prior to that. And unlike meat, which must be hunted and then prepared, bread does not exist until it is prepared. So it is truly a cultural invention. It's a complete transformation of the starting materials. Cereal grains and water become bread. And just by looking at bread, we couldn't tell what it's made of, if we didn't know already. It looks, smells, tastes different. It has become a completely different product.
For thousands of years, flour, water, and salt have served as the basic ingredients for a magical process that begins in the early morning hours of a bakery. Because there's one particular ingredient that belongs in every loaf.
We give our bread lots of time and love.
I think that bread is so present in culture and religion because it's not just something that even the poorest or the richest will eat, but it's something that's not actually that easy to make.
The significance of bread is already apparent in the Bible. One of Christianity's best-known rituals is the Holy Communion, where Jesus gave wine to his disciples and broke bread with them.
I think because, in a sense, it's the bottom line. It's the most accessible, democratic food. It provides nutrition to everybody on a basic level.
Bread is so basic that it has to come to serve as the symbol for food. We encounter it time and again in art and literature. If you trace bread back to its origins, the path invariably leads to ancient Egypt. Like so many things, the art of baking began here over 6,000 years ago. And sourdough is also something that we owe to the Egyptians.
Opinions differ as to who invented sourdough. Legend has it that it was ancient Egyptians. At least, this is where the oldest pieces of evidence is found. Most likely some cereal porridge, their staple food, was left in the sun and began to ferment. Reluctant to throw it away, they found that the resulting flatbread was tastier than the ones they made before.
In ancient Egypt, the word for life, aish, stood for bread. And if you give credence to an old Arab saying, then life without aish is no life at all.
Obviously, other cultures and geographical locations have different climates, different cooking methods, and different foods to put their bread with, so they come up with different types of bread.
Even today, bread, or flatbread, is still made the same way it's always been made.
As well as transforming your grain into a much more nutritious substance, it also acts as a fermenting agent during the bread-making process, turning your lump of flour and water into a light, fluffy loaf of bread. It's how the Egyptians made their bread, and it must have seemed like magic.
Part of this magical process is fermentation. It makes for a soft and airy dough. It's why the ancient Egyptians were referred to as bread eaters by the Greeks.
A decent loaf of bread takes skill, it takes good grain, it takes the right cooking equipment, it takes the right recipe, and it takes a lot of patience. All of those things need to come together to make a loaf of bread.
In today's industrial-scale bakeries, fermentation still takes place the way it did in ancient Egypt. Bacteria in the so-called sourdough trigger a fermentation process, the basis for an internal airy texture. Flour and sourdough are mixed and left to ripen into easily digestible bread within 40 hours.
Producing something like sourdough bread is no easy process, and even with machines that can theoretically do it all for you, you've got to keep a really close eye on temperature, on cooling processes, on length fermentation, and yeast and sourdough can behave in very unpredictable ways. So even with machinery, it needs that human touch.
Lactic and acetic acids, yeasts and alcohols develop in sourdough and form CO2, which leavens the bread.
These days, sourdough is largely made for health purposes because this bread is more easily digestible. Since sourdough has already been partially pre-digested, the body is able to absorb the available minerals from rye or other grain varieties more readily. Sourdough has the effect of unlocking grains and making their nutrients available.
Since the dough needs time to rest, however, this goes hand in hand with lots of time, and thus money. Yeasts were discovered in parallel to sourdough.
Yeast is a fungus, a single-celled microorganism that rapidly reproduces when nutrients are abundant.
A time-effective alternative to leavened dough. Whether one bakes bread using yeast or sourdough is, in the end, a matter of preference and time.
Yeast speeds up the processes that occur during dough development. The more I add, the quicker the dough reaches the point at which it's ready to bake. If I want to save time, I add a lot of yeast. The bread sold at budget supermarkets always smells distinctly yeasty.
And yeast has also brought us entirely new bakery goods.
Yeast essentially revolutionized the bakery trade by making possible baked goods that either weren't possible before or were connected with too much work. So basically, everything made with wheat flour, breakfast rolls, pizza, and so on. Yeast gave rise to these things while pushing sourdough baked goods into the background.
And this baked treat wouldn't be around without yeast. It was in 1899 that the first pizza margherita was topped in Italy's national colours: green basil, white mozzarella, and red tomatoes. Yeast also gave us fluffy sandwich bread.
So the origin of the word sandwich, as the story goes, and it's certainly a story that's dear to my heart, it comes from a game of cards, because there was this aristocrat, John Montague, and he supposedly was playing this very, very, very long game, and he got hungry, but he absolutely did not want to leave the table, as presumably he was making lots of money. And so he ordered his valet to go and get him just a really dense meal. He said, "Oh, give me a piece of meat between two bits of bread." And everyone was very surprised and confused by this bizarre food item, but it then became popularized by his other name, which was the 4th Earl of Sandwich. So yeah, supposedly that's where it comes from.
So yeast ensures that the crumb is tender and springy, but another use for it was quickly found. Yeast fungus not only leavens dough, it also makes alcohol and CO2 from sugar, and thus gives us beer. Microscopic organisms leaven our bread and turn hops, malt and water into beer.
Somehow bread is always connected with alcohol. On the one hand, because alcohol is produced in the dough itself, which makes the bread more palatable. On the other hand, you can make it from cereal grains, also using the same fermentation processes, though somewhat modified. Other conditions but the same processes take place during beer brewing or whiskey making.
We've come a long way from the traditional bake shop to modern bread production.
The baker in the Middle Ages was an absolutely crucial member of the community, and the baker would be expected to produce high-quality loaves. And if he reduced the quality in any way, left out ingredients, public punishments would lie in store for him, and he would be put in a cage and dipped in the river in full public view so that he would never do that again.
It can be seen as pre-industrial quality assurance. Even today, next to industrial production, we still have craft bakeries like this one, where 6 days a week, bakers toil through the night. Each of these loaves was kneaded using muscle power. Hands can feel if the consistency and temperature are right. Outfitting a machine with this kind of mechanical sensitivity is difficult, and yet an essential step forward for all of us.
By 1850, you get new machinery that can knead bread for you on a scale that's been absolutely impossible before. So after 1850, bread making was completely transformed. You could make it en masse, much cheaper than ever before.
Kneading by hand quickly became an obstacle to producing the large amounts of bread needed in the industrial age. The solution? A kneading machine. It smooths the way to quicker and more hygienic production. While it doesn't require hands, it does require the exact same batter mix to operate smoothly. But when this requirement is met, these machines work absolutely tirelessly.
What I would say is that everything was different in the past. I don't believe that things were better, though. With regard to bakeries, it's a big advantage to have transparency and hygienic requirements that must be observed.
Accused of working with dirty hands and using the kneading trough instead of a handkerchief, the reputation of bakers was maligned for a long time. A lack of hygiene in connection with hand kneading was to be remedied by the introduction of machines, a real selling point. And these new kneading machines quickly became popular. Mechanization was an unstoppable force. Today, industrial production is the rule. It makes bread less expensive, not just to manufacture, but also for the customer. Industrial bread production has evolved rapidly since World War II. A flood of new machines is making greater variety possible. Machines not only handle the kneading, but also the shaping. More and more industrially produced varieties become available. The growth of the factories goes in step with greater and more varied output. Some of the plants have been in operation for decades.
It's all been automated, with sort of almost like production lines. But the upside of that is that it's far more efficient, and that's important if we need to feed many, many people as cheaply as possible.
One of the main differences compared to early large-scale bakeries is that today the individual processing steps, kneading, proportioning, shaping dough pieces and fermenting, are largely automated. Bread is fermented in these baskets. Experienced eyes recognize and monitor this biological process and make sure that none of the loaves are baked before they're ready.
Bakers bake their bread here. Baking as an art form is very important for us. Is the bread properly shaped? Has the dough been properly fermented? Is the baking process exactly right? A baker must be able to evaluate all these things.
Baking all these breads day by day is an unbelievable achievement. Huge quantities are needed. The global population continues to increase. Specialized continuous feed ovens provide even greater capacity. The baking lines in this industrial bakery produce between 2,000 and 3,000 loaves of bread per hour. These crusty loaves proceed on a perfectly plotted journey every day to reliably fill our supermarket shelves.
Unlike human labor, a machine is tireless. It can produce endless quantities in consistently high quality.
To produce up to 600,000 loaves of bread per day, man, machines and flour must be perfectly synchronized. This avoids fluctuations in taste and quality. But it takes an oven to make bread out of dough. Presumably, the first bread was baked on a hot rock at an open fire. The Egyptians fine-tuned this idea and built the first stone ovens. Such ovens are still used today and require a lot of experience. After the fire has heated up the stone oven for 3 hours, the embers are removed and bread is baked in the residual heat. There was no thermostat or an off-on switch. To reach and hold the desired temperature was an art in itself. Bread has been baked using this traditional, though time-consuming way for thousands of years. The flames of a stone oven impart flavor to bread. It took a long time before modern-day bakers dispensed with fire so that they could bake more quickly and predictably. In order to bake bread, human beings first had to farm and cultivate grains, a decisive step for our transition from hunters and gatherers to settled farmers.
We're all hunter-gatherers, we're all nomadic people moving around, hunting animals, going to the animals, never staying in one space. Once we decide that cultivating crops can give us a sustainable, reliable supply of food, we can stay in one place. We can grow our wheat, we can grow our grain, we can develop our bread-making technology, and we can stay put, and we can become communities.
This gave them the first clue that settling down and cultivating grain might be the way forward. So instead of nomadic tribes roaming through the land, they stayed in one place and grew grain. Settlements and agriculture and bread are the start of our modern civilization.
Grains not only spared us from going hungry, since they are also durable and can be stored for long periods, it became possible to make provisions for the future. A major step towards that gave us existential security. And to this day, it gives us security, also in the form of these emergency reserves. 800,000 tons of food, for example, are being stored at 150 different sites in Germany. This stockpile would last for several weeks.
Storing grain is there to protect communities. It's useful to store grain for emergencies, for war, for drought, for invading armies, that sort of thing. And even today we have at secret locations emergency storage stores of grain in order to call upon if absolutely necessary.
But it wasn't until high-yield varieties were developed from wild grasses that enough was left over to make warehousing like this possible. The ancestors of today's varieties are stored in this archive. Before we settled down, bread was made from very tiny grass seeds that had to be gathered in nature in a laborious process. With the help of modern technology, today we try to identify plant genes that generate high yields. And yet, this continues to be a drawn-out process of trial and error, just like it was during past millennia.
If you're a scientist trying to develop new types of grain for the future of human nutrition and agriculture, you need a lot of patience because developing a new grain type takes about 12 years.
Crossbreeding the most healthy and highest yielding cereal plants is still the method of choice. Just how much higher the yields of our modern varieties are can be seen by holding up a modern ear of wheat against its wild ancestors.
So the modern grains that we see today are largely a result of sort of selective breeding, where farmers would choose you know, the sort of highest yield plants with the thickest grains, and also sort of the narrowest stems so that they could be planted together more densely and more efficiently. And the result of that is over, you know, many generations are these modern day plants that we see.
For today's bread production, we have cereal varieties with ears that are thick and full of grains. Flour production in ancient Egypt started out as very cumbersome work. It takes 7 or 8 hours to produce 2 kilograms of flour using 2 millstones like these.
This is, of course, a very antiquated technique, and surprising for an advanced civilization like ancient Egypt. But there obviously was no desire to change things, since there were enough people who could do this work.
But it's not always like this. A technological evolution, which is still underway, took hold and made it possible to exploit the valuable inside of a kernel.
Over the millennia, the technology for grinding grain has become more and more sophisticated, more and more efficient, more and more automated.
Grinding the grains between 2 millstones with muscle power alone would soon become a thing of the past. The human pioneering spirit gave us a more effective method, the mill. And over the course of time, it was to evolve rapidly.
The first mills were driven by muscle power, either humans or unfortunate animals like donkeys. The Romans were the first to incorporate the immense energy carried by rivers by building water wheels.
Water-powered mills established themselves right along with windmills. Both take advantage of the forces of nature. And, as we know, these are unpredictable. But it is only when the blades catch wind that the millstones are driven. This changed with the advent of smock mills in the 16th century. The entire mill can be rotated to make it independent of the wind direction.
For a long time, grain mills sort of represented a huge leap forward in human ingenuity.
Wind energy drove the millstones without muscle power and turned grain into easily digestible flour, a milestone in our development. Mills are the first prime movers of our time, and they're critical for provisioning a growing population.
To feed a growing population, the bread production process had to become more efficient. And the mill was responsible for that in part. And that phrase, the mill, doesn't just describe the milling of the flour, it's also a mark of excellence for the flour that's produced.
These days, our mills are no longer dependent on wind. Grains are milled into flour by means of electric power. Currently, industrial mills ensure that we humans never run out of flour. Meanwhile, sophisticated methods make an even greater variety of flours possible.
Today's bakers are in constant contact with their millers. And using technology, those mills can create just the right flour for exactly the right resulting bread.
Coarsely grounded whole meat flour for robust breads or finely ground white flour for light, soft loaves. Without the many different flour types, we wouldn't have today's wide range of breads. Bakers need to know what kind of bread they plan to bake so the right flour can be ordered from the miller. Even today, artisan bakers can still feel the different characteristics with their hands.
Millers often say, there is no such thing as the wrong flour. There's only bad applications.
Up until about 200 years ago, it was only possible to make whole wheat flour using coarse millstones. So for a long time that determined the range of breads offered. A new discovery at the beginning of the 19th century would completely change the way in which we mill flour, roller mills. This milling technology was so efficient that it's still used, unchanged, in the industrial mills of our day. The grains are fed into the roller mill from above. The grains are broken open and crushed between two metal corrugated rollers. The trick is that the distance between the rollers can be precisely adjusted. The greater the distance, the coarser the flour. The smaller the distance, the finer the flour. The flours that we use today, especially white flour, go back to the invention of the roller mill.
Schmidt's Blue Ribbon Bread gives you 7 ounces of non-fat milk solids in every loaf, the equal of 90 quarts a year if you serve it regularly. Every sandwich you make, every snack, gives you extra milk.
With the invention of the roller mill, white flour and thus white wheat bread suddenly became available in great quantities. Prior to this, whole wheat flour needed to be sieved in a very elaborate process to get white flour, and this was not affordable for most of the population.
Across many centuries, white bread carried high prestige. It was made for aristocrats and kings, rulers and the wealthy.
The roller mill democratized bread diversity.
Fine light flours for white fluffy bread, or more substantial flours with fibre and a more rustic taste?
In fact, the expression toast, with wine, comes from bread, and that's because back in the day, the lords and ladies would soak their toasted bread in the wine to sort of soothe the acidity of it, and then presumably they clunked their glasses together and said toast.
But the abundance of white bread also came with a downside.
Trim, youthful, active, the modern look that spotlights you. The secret? Low-calorie bread. It gives you extra energy.
Those who ate white bread exclusively became sick and overweight, even though the advertisements promised something else. Using just white flour led to bread with low fiber and nutrient content.
Eat Wonder Bread.
But the bread industry tried to take countermeasures. Bread that used to consist of only flour, water and salt was enriched with additives. The new light flour varieties had led to nutrient-poor bread.
Grow bigger and stronger 8 ways.
This desire for white bread has backfired, as our generation now are much less active than previous generations. So now we're turning to the lower calorie, more fibre-rich artisan breads that are popular today.
That's because the nutrient and fibre-rich outer skin, or bran, is filtered out when producing white flour. So today, even modern industrial mills are experiencing growing demand for whole wheat flours. Bread that is made with whole grains has yet another advantage. It makes us feel full longer. It's not just a broad variety of flours that we owe to windmills. Wind energy would soon set more than just heavy millstones into motion.
The mills that were introduced in the early modern period have now become the stimulation, the source for what we now see as sustainable, environmentally friendly energy.
The idea of taking advantage of wind and hydropower and turning it into mechanical energy is something that we owe to bread making. The clever use of energies way beyond what we are physically capable of benefits our civilization. These mills thus went hand in hand with an unforeseeable side effect that's more important today than ever before.
And I mean, these windmills sort of paved the way for the modern design of these wind turbines that we now use to generate our electricity. So they really were the sort of forerunners in renewable energy.
The centuries-old technology of grain mills gives us the opportunity to counteract looming climate change. The spirit of the old mills lives on in today's renewable energies. A single wind turbine with an output of 3 megawatts generates electricity for more than 2,000 households per year.
This set the trend for today's energy-producing water turbines.
hydropower too, as one of our oldest sources of energy, is highly topical again thanks to climate change. 17%, so almost 1/5 of the energy worldwide, is generated by hydropower. Evolving technologies can sometimes bear incredible fruit. Today's industrial mills also use wind and water-generated energy. The industrial scale has amplified everything. 500 tons of grain is processed here on a daily basis. There are no surpluses, as only ordered quantities are processed. The grain is immediately checked for smell, pesticides, and microbiological purity. 25 tons of grain are transported by road directly from the farmer to the mill silos for processing. These cereal grains are the basis of our nourishment. But before they can end up in a loaf of bread, these grains still have a long way to go. That's because these kernels are a natural product that owe their purity and safety to modern technology. For thousands of years, this is not something that should be taken for granted. In the next step, the grain kernels are thoroughly cleaned.
During threshing, the stones are pulled in via the cereal plant and its root. The farmer moves across the field in the harvester and automatically has contact with the soil, and thus also the stones.
But it's not just field stones that pose a danger. This scanner protects us from a toxin that has been lurking in cereal since primeval times, an almost black mass called ergot, which infects the ear of a cereal plant.
Ergot is a fungus that affects grains, especially rye, and it looks like a tiny black mushroom which can be mistaken for a grain. So if it gets ground up into the flour, it could end up in the resulting bread, which would be fine, except that ergot is highly toxic.
People in the Middle Ages were completely at the mercy of this hidden danger that lurked in their flour. Ergot poisoning led to convulsions and hallucinations. A mere 5 to 10 grams were lethal. Outbreaks of ergotism were such a threat that the monks of St. Anthony set up special hospitals.
And it developed a condition called hellfire or Antonius fire, which led to terrible itching and terrible scratching and sometimes limbs having to be amputated, people going mad.
Colour scanning now protects us from this threat by targeting the dark ergot and removing it with the help of a blast of high-pressure air.
There was no way of filtering it, no way of cleaning it, and no quality checks like you get today.
Fortunately, ergotism is a thing of the past. These colour scanners have spared many people from a painful death.
What we're dealing with here is a typical ergot body as it occurs in nature. Today, our colour scanner reliably identifies and removes them. In the past, in the Middle Ages, this couldn't be done, and many people got sick. The baking process can't destroy the poisonous alkaloids that ergot produces, and so they were consumed by people along with the food they ate.
It's the alkaloids that are found in ergot fungi that cause ergotism in humans.
One of the effects of eating ergot-infected bread was to suffer from nervous seizures or fits, and also suffer hallucinations. And in this very religious society, it must have seemed that those who'd eaten ergot-infected bread must have been possessed by the devil.
Even as late as 1951, one area of France captured the headlines. Pont Saint-Esprit, the village with the bread that makes you crazy.
Hundreds of people in the village became desperately ill, but on top of that, they were having many very vivid hallucinations. I think some people even killed themselves. It was really bad.
Psychoses, anxiety, and hallucinations gripped the little village and led to several deaths. More than 200 people were treated in hospitals or psychiatric institutions. It seemed like the village population had succumbed to madness, an outbreak of mass hallucinations. Evidence of ergot was found in the baker's contaminated flour. The eyewitness reports corresponded with the results of a self-experiment conducted by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. My whole environment had transformed itself in a most frightening way. Familiar objects took on a menacing quality. They were in motion as though they were alive. The lady next door was no longer Mrs. R, but a wicked witch with a grotesque face. By coincidence, 3 years earlier, Hofmann had synthesized LSD from ergot in his lab.
I mean, imagine what it must have been like for these people who were probably largely superstitious folks, believing in all sorts of, spirits and so on, to suddenly having these sort of LSD-like hallucinations. It must have been absolutely terrifying.
Along with industrially produced bread, we still have small bakeries today as well. Craft bakeries attach a lot of importance to working with real sourdough. They try not to rely on quick-rise yeasts or additives that make the dough rise faster and allow plenty of time for the dough to rest. Nevertheless, they must remain competitive.
You have to aim for a seamless transition so that the ovens are always in use and we can make money. If an oven is empty, this causes unnecessary energy costs. We can't operate like that.
The downside of industrial bread production is that small bakeries are going out of business. This bakery has been able to defy that trend. So this is how the big competitors operate. Loaves are churned out on conveyor belts. Progressing along the oven, they cover more than 80 meters. They move alongside a conveyor belt through various hot zones where water vapor can be added for a crispy crust. Finally, perfectly baked loaves emerge. Conveyor ovens bake loaves of bread in quantities that exceed anything that was possible before. Another factor that gives us bread in great quantities and small prices is that machines have taken control, in contrast to artisan bakers.
You can tell it has a proper crust. It's wonderful. It bounces back. It's elastic. I'll push on it very hard now. Now, if this happened with normal pressure, it wouldn't be a good quality loaf. The bread would bunch up in one's mouth and wouldn't have much flavor either. This loaf has lots of air voids which develop the taste and aroma. And you can hear it too. It has a proper crust. It's a flawless bread. When I see a loaf like that, my heart sings.
My favorite kind of bread is probably a French baguette. My least favorite is one of those dry, bitter, dark breads. Ugh. I like my bread really doughy and squishy, which is, I always got in trouble with my mum because I'd always scoop the middle out of the French bread and leave the crust. That's the good bit.
My preferred bread is a crusty Italian pane rustico, so rustic bread, really raw, really rustic, with olive oil and balsamic vinegar, warmed up, possibly with a nice glass of Chianti on the side.
My favourite bread has to be sourdough bread. I am a sourdough mother myself. I have my sourdough Betty, who lives in the refrigerator at home. And for me, sourdough has it all. It's got the crunchy crust, it's got the fluffy, moist inside, and it's got that distinctive acid tang. Sourdough is perfect.
A loaf of bread is more than nourishment for the body. It gives us comfort and a sense of security. It's among our most constant foods. For thousands of years, it has been part of almost every meal. And bread is politics like hardly any other food. When there's a hike in the price of bread, it can disturb the balance of power.
For politicians and governments around the world, the price of grain is an important factor in keeping their country calm. If weather-related crop failures or suddenly inaccessible trade routes cause grain to become more expensive, it can have a real knock-on effect on the government, as individual workers have to pay 3 times the normal rate for their daily bread.
To this day, bread is an essential. When the supply is low, it leads to political unrest. Governments have always tried to keep the price of bread low to maintain their grip on power. An extremely cold winter in France destroyed most of the cereal harvest in 1789 and led to a doubling of the price of bread. This further inflamed the fury of an already agitated populace. What followed was the outbreak of the French Revolution. The price of bread is closely linked with the weather. Harvest failures and diseases can cause prices to explode. The Arab Spring was also triggered like this.
Bread is a hugely important topic. Wars and crises can be caused by bread shortages that set off waves of unrest. It's the primary basis for everything, for politics, for the social system, and for human sustenance.
And global warming is making the weather more extreme. Climate change threatens the basis of our human existence, our cereals.
A hotter climate means we need heat-resistant plants, and we need to create some kind of reliable and nutritious source of food for our growing population.
Climate change necessitates more hardy types of grain. Researchers are looking for gene variants in the genetic material of plants that will make them more resistant. This would ensure good yields and stable harvest results in a changing climate.
How can we protect our grains and our plants for potential climate change? We can breed species of plants in order to produce hardier plants against various types of climate change.
To defy climate change, we need the entire gene pool of cereals available worldwide. The Global Seed Vault was established for this purpose. Protected in the permafrost of a mountain in the Arctic Ocean, over 4 million types of cereal can be stored here in order to secure the heritage and future of our Earth.
The grains that we use now are almost nothing like the natural ones that our ancestors turned into bread. Nowadays, the yields have increased many times over, the ears are bigger, the stalks are shorter but stronger, so break less often. And this new grain is an important part of our supply of food for the future.
We have built a solid basis on which to secure the food supply for future generations. We are, after all, able to draw on a wealth of information. Over millennia, humankind has spared no effort, nor has its pioneering spirit languished when it comes to improving bread production.
These days, if you buy bread off the supermarket shelves, it's sort of almost like production lines of pieces of bread being cut up and so on. But the upside of that is that it's far more efficient, and that's important if we need to feed many, many people as cheaply as possible.
From the field into the mill, from grain to flour, from the bakery to a fragrant loaf. The long genesis of a grain to bread is testimony to our inventive genius. Dexterity is needed, along with technology and the innovations that facilitated this work.
Bread is a great food. It's been part of our culture and our diets for so long that I'm sure it will continue to be part of it in the future.
As long as we exist, there will also be bread. But how we produce it, which cereal grains are milled, and finally, how exactly we want it to taste, this will be subject to constant change.